Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede. A couple of weeks ago, I took a deep dive into the scandal surrounding Miami-Dade State Attorney Katherine Fernandez Rundle. Two of her prosecutors were removed from a death penalty case after a judge found they had committed prosecutorial misconduct by manipulating witnesses and even saying that reasonable minds could conclude that one of Rundle's prosecutors might have suggested a troublesome witness be murdered, a claim the prosecutor denied. We also talked about how her office bungled the investigation into the murder of Rabbi Joseph Raxon. She wrongly accused and charged a 15-year-old with murder, and now it appears, as a result, there will be no justice for the rabbi's family. And of course, there are all the times she left police officers off the hook for bad shootings. And look, I get it. If no one files to run against her by the end of next week, the 74-year-old Rundle will automatically be reelected. But I still think the way she has been running that office for the past 3 decades will continue to be worth scrutinizing, especially on the issue of public corruption. Is she doing enough? She brought a few cases, but does she really strike fear into the hearts of crooked politicians in South Florida? I'm not so sure. And I'm not the only one who apparently thinks not enough is being done when it comes to public corruption. Watch this ad by James Reyes, a candidate for Miami-Dade Sheriff.
When it comes to keeping our neighborhoods safe, Chief James Reyes has what it takes to serve as the first elected sheriff of Miami-Dade in 60 years. Husband and father of 3 small children, has 25 years of law enforcement experience, and the only candidate with executive leadership in a sheriff's office. In his first 30 days, will create a public corruption unit to deliver on his promise of accountability for our community.
Reyes is vowing to finally do something about public corruption because clearly it is a major problem that his campaign consultants believe voters care about. But there is also the flip side to that. It can also be seen as a failure on the part of Mayor Danielle Levine Cava for not creating a robust corruption unit in the Miami-Dade Police Department when she's had a chance to do so for 3 years, and a weakness of Miami-Dade State Attorney Katherine Fernandez Rundle for not doing enough to prosecute public corruption cases. And to show you how incestuous Miami-Dade politics is, the person running Reyes' campaign for sheriff on a platform of fighting public corruption is Christian Overt, who is also the political consultant for Mayor Levine Cava and State Attorney Katherine Fernandez Rundle. In a statement to CBS Miami, the Reyes campaign said the ad is not a reflection of other leaders in the community, but rather a promise and commitment to the public in his campaign that he will implement proven strategies that work in other jurisdictions here, like having a sheriff's public corruption unit that works in collaboration with other law enforcement agencies in the area. And for his part, Christian Overt released a statement to CBS Miami that says he sees no conflict of interest in running the campaigns of the mayor, the sheriff, and the state attorney, noting, "I am an independent campaign advisor that works with dozens of elected leaders across Florida, and my work ends when the elections conclude." Even when Rundle does bring a public corruption case, she is not particularly aggressive. Let's talk about a current case. Nearly 4 years ago, during the 2020 election, there was a coordinated and well-financed effort to take out Democratic Senate candidates by using so-called ghost candidates, candidates with the same or similar last names to actual candidates, as a way of confusing voters and siphoning votes away from Democrats. The group allegedly violated campaign finance laws by injecting more than $700,000 in dark money into these ghost candidates. Frank Artiles, a disgraced former state senator, was charged more than 3 years ago with violating campaign finance laws, charges he denies. His trial is set for later this year. All right, joining me now is Javier Fernandez, one of the candidates who Artiles allegedly targeted with a ghost candidate. He joins me here in studio, and of course, Javier is now the mayor of South Miami. Javier, thank you for coming in.
Jim, good to be with you.
I know we've had this conversation before, and there's a little bit of a frustration. I know that you've tweeted about it, that Rundle's office has not done enough on this case and not brought this case along fast enough. Tell me what you're thinking.
Sure. Look, Jim, running for public office is incredibly hard, particularly in the minority when you're running in a partisan race here in South Florida. And, not only was I a victim, although it had no impact on my race, quite honestly, for the Senate, But, I've been the subject in my 2 prior House races of these dark money tactics, these attempts to add candidacies to confuse voters. In my first race, we had a committee that didn't report a dollar of income or expenses for the entire race, but sent 11 mailers and had canvassers walking to promote the candidacy of an independent candidate in that race. And so, these practices, and in that case, it's my strong belief that Mr. Artiles was also involved, have been part of the playbook for Republicans here in South Florida, and they go unreported. They go uncontested.
You made the point that it didn't have an impact ultimately in your race, but one race that it did have an impact on was when Jose Javier Rodriguez was running for the state Senate to run again, to win. He was the target of a lot of negative stuff, including a candidate who got into the race to siphon off votes, and Ileana Garcia ended up winning that race by 32 votes, even though the ghost candidate pulled about 6,000 votes. You think it's pretty clear Javier would have won that race?
Jim, I'm here because Jose Javier Rodriguez could not speak about this because he was nominated to be made a cabinet member. And so I'm here because of that, in part, because someone has to tell that story. That seat was stolen, just unquestionably stolen. What happened there, it was an affront to our democratic system, and we've had a lot of conversation in the public domain about elections integrity, and in this community, no one, particularly our state attorney, has been doing anything to hold people accountable and make them play by the limited rules we have that govern campaigns.
So now, obviously one of the things that you could say is, well, look, Katherine Fernandez Rundle brought the case against Artiles. She filed charges, and so isn't that enough?
And that's great, but justice delayed is not justice done. Mr. Artiles deserves his day in court to defend his reputation, and the public needs an accounting, a contemporaneous accounting of what happened with that case. And 4 years to go by and not have a reckoning, not have the story told about how Republicans manipulated not only that one election, but frankly changed the trajectory of the Florida Senate to pass all sorts of laws that might have gone by the wayside in a more contested Senate, a more evenly divided Senate. This case has had, this election has had far-reaching impacts for state policy. A lot of bad policies come out of Tallahassee, out of an unbalanced Senate, because of the results of that one election. And frankly, because the prosecution has been so protracted, right? Whatever verdict comes up will be the subject of questioning by people who don't believe that there was a manipulation, or people frankly won't care because they won't be able to relate to the actual events that took place.
Because it happened so long ago.
It happened so long ago.
Well, here's the other part of it that I find fascinating and has always troubled me is it seemed to me that this was an opportunity to really get at who was it really empowered? Nobody, I don't think, again, the allegations are against Frank Artiles. He denies them. But I also don't think anybody believes that if Frank Artiles is guilty of this, that he is the mastermind behind all of it. There is clearly people much higher, much above him who are funneling the money. There's been a lot of reporting done that a lot of the money came from groups like Florida Power and Light, which had an antipathy towards various Democratic Senate candidates. And we never really get to the heart of it. And it seems to me as if Rundle's office could have done more, not just in prosecuting more aggressively the Artiles case, but really trying to get to who was behind it. And I haven't seen any effort to that.
Look, that is what creates the crisis of confidence of the public in our current political system, right? She has to prosecute these cases without fear or favor or concern about the repercussions to her or her office by possibly shining a light on people who are powerful, who are manipulating the system. That's what's not happened here. And the public needs to understand how this process, the processes that we have in place, are being manipulated by a small cohort of people to advance their own political or economic interests. That's what. That's.
Do you think she's scared to take on powerful people?
I don't know why someone who's been in that office for 31 years, right, and successfully been reelected 6 times, would fear anyone, frankly. I would expect them to have the courage to do their job without fear of retribution and lead. But there's not only a crisis of leadership on the public corruption side. Frankly, we have a tremendous threat to public safety, and her office is woefully understaffed. We're all struggling with recruiting given the current economic climate in South Florida. But on the public safety side, she's been woefully absent as well, and highlighting the fact that she's struggling to hire prosecutors, frontline prosecutors, to hold common criminals to account, not just on the public corruption front.
Well, part of that, to give her her due, that is a salary set by the state legislature.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
right?
but
so she's had trouble recruiting candidates to take those jobs because of the high cost of living in South Florida.
I will say the following: I'm a one-term mayor of a very small city in South Miami. When I go to my legislative delegation and ask them for resources, I tend to get them. And so I think it's also a crisis of leadership in sort of taking action and marshaling the coalitions that are necessary to address the problem.
Why do you think no one is stepped up to run against her?
There is this sense of invincibility, and there's a desire, again, it'd be very convenient for me not to speak on this program about what I think is a real crisis in her office. There are probably going to be consequences for my being on air and talking about this issue. I'm sure I'm going to get some phone calls from very unhappy people later this weekend. But the truth of the matter is that this is probably among the most important jobs in all of the state, right? She not only is charged with ensuring the integrity of criminal prosecutions, but also safeguarding our democracy. And we've heard a lot at the national level about concerns about what's happened. And we hear constantly in the political narrative of every election cycle, the last two cycles, about election integrity issues. And here, where there is, I think, a blatant case, a black and white case of manipulation, to have a prosecution delayed 3.5 years, to me, is just unconscionable. The public needs to understand what's going on. People need to be held accountable, because when we do not hold people to account, they start with small violations and they grow. That's what's happened, in my opinion, in the case of Frank Artiles and other actors like David Rivera and on, who she's failed to timely prosecute as well.
The David Rivera case you talk about, that was a number of years ago. They actually had prepared a charging document against her, and then they decided not to file it. And it took years later before the federal government is now bringing David Rivera to account. And it started
with $1 million that he fleeced the Havernicks from, and it ended up, I think you broke that story, and it now ends with him involved in another scheme to defraud the Venezuelan government, right? And again, no sympathy for Mr. Maduro, but nonetheless, the crimes grow, the violations escalate. That's because they go unchecked.
We only have about a minute and a half left. My next guest is going to be Jeff Fernandez, who's talking about affordability and housing issues. So I'm going to take a hard turn, because I know as the mayor in South Miami, this is an issue that you care a lot about. This idea of trying to do better with housing issues. We're going to talk with Jeff Fernandez about the whole issue of vouchers, and also about zoning. And I know that there was the Live Local campaign in Florida to try to improve, housing abilities here. But it turned out to be a giveaway to developers. I'm afraid that I'm not going to see it. What's your take on the issue of affordability and housing right now?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't characterize it as a giveaway to developers, because frankly, building units is very difficult in today's environment, particularly with the insurance and financing climate that we have. So I think this is a generational bill in many respects that will help lead to more production. I think it does a great job on the workforce housing front, helping people that are struggling to find affordable units at the upper tiers of those income brackets. But for folks at the lower end that really are traditional service workers, this bill will do very little for them. It's going to come at a very substantial public cost in terms of subsidies from local governments. And yes, there have been some troubling issues on the zoning preemption side, but I have to give some credit to the sponsors who worked very tirelessly over the last session to mitigate some of those impacts. And I know, given the ascendancy of some of the members of our Dade delegation, that we'll see some further reforms that'll bring some of those things into further balance, I think, for the good.
So are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic about the trajectory of the bill and its continued possibilities to expand housing opportunities, and also then get back to a better balance between local government rights and the needs to kind of produce housing. But there's still a lot of work to do. But I think it'll get done over the next year.
Javier, thank you very much for coming in.
Jim, my pleasure.
When we come back, we will talk about affordable housing, as I just said, and what the state can be doing and should be doing. Stay with us. Welcome back. With 1,000 people every day moving into the state of Florida, affordable housing remains a major problem. The Florida Policy Project has been examining the issue and is offering some solutions. The group was started by former State Senator Jeff Fernandez, who I spoke to about affordable housing earlier this week.
Understand, Florida has 1,000 people a day moving to the state. Affordable housing is one of the top issues of the state of Florida right now. And the state system that it currently utilizes doesn't really address the underlying changes, really has been unchanged for almost decades for how we address housing affordability in Florida. And so, we're calling on the legislature to do more by just moving towards best practices. So we've done a whole series of reports on what those best practices should look like, from changing zoning to addressing vouchers.
All right, let's start with the zoning part of it. We just had, a major push by the state's Senate president, Kathleen Passidomo, was sort of a live local. Did live local fix the zoning aspect of this?
Really not at all. I mean, I would say live local is probably a 3% solution to the overall problem. In fact, obviously, you have some communities that are pushing back against live local pretty stringently right now. We need to really address this more holistically. If you don't fix zoning, we don't fix housing. And that means addressing single family home zoning and allowing duplexes and quads to be built there through upzoning, to allowing smaller lot sizes so that people can afford the actual lots they're on. And then addressing other issues throughout the system that we lay out in our report. But the simple truth is we have to address these things. The state of Florida has to reset the incentives so that cities and counties will then come in line and allow for more housing units to be built. We're just never going to get there if we continue to follow the same old tired housing policies that we've had before. The shortest putt is accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law suites, granny flats, whatever you want to call them, that are on the backs of people's homes. I can tell you in Tampa Bay, it will cost you about $350,000 per apartment unit that you want to build. I can build that same accessory dwelling unit on the back of somebody's home for about $150,000 to $170,000. And so if we really need kind of an all hands on deck strategy, and that's something that Florida is currently greatly lacking.
In talking to some local mayors, I know that they're concerned about what the legislature has done. And when they hear you or others talk about increasing density, the fear is that developers are going to come in a way that will suddenly create 10, 12, 14-story buildings in neighborhood environments.
We need to look at best practices as to what works in communities. And what I don't think Live Local was set off of was best practices. I think it was largely written by developers who wanted certain things in their development projects and were able to put those through. I think we should really offer communities a menu of options. Now, they would have to choose from that menu in order to qualify for housing dollars from Tallahassee. But it would offer things like more accessory dwelling units, offer opportunities for upzoning, offer a robust voucher programs that they could initiate, and if they followed best practices to do that. But we really need to turn this into block grants to the counties. Look, every county has different set of problems. Miami-Dade has very different problems than Hardy or Hendry or Liberty County does. And so treating one size fits all housing solutions just don't work in Florida. But we need an opportunity to do that. And we think that the best way to do that is by following best practices. And those include utilizing housing vouchers and a best practice model for housing vouchers. For example, in Miami-Dade, people will wait almost 14 years if they get on the waiting list to get a voucher. That's unacceptable. In Hollywood, it's 6 years. In some other communities, it's much less. The national average is about 21 months. So we can move much more, we go much quicker if we establish a robust housing voucher program while we're addressing all these other issues like upzoning, like
let me just jump in. How do you create that more robust voucher system?
Well, we put in best practices for different housing systems. For example, we need to be scrubbing wait lists. The challenge is sometimes we have multiple entities that have housing wait lists and nobody's actually going back to scrub them. We actually need more dollars allocated towards those programs. We need more developers to buy in to accepting housing vouchers. One of the things we hear right now is developers don't want to take housing vouchers because they don't know what's coming with them. They don't know the type of tenant they're going to get. So we need some type of conversation to occur with developers to say, what incentives do you need in order to take these housing vouchers? But I think it shows we need an all hands on deck approach, and it needs to be a conversation with the development communities, with cities and counties, and frankly, with residents that need assistance. And that conversation isn't occurring in Tallahassee. In fact, to my knowledge, there's not one study going on right now in Tallahassee on housing. And that's just unacceptable when housing is one of the top issues of the state of Florida.
So you have a summit coming up on May 1st in the Tampa area where you're going to be discussing this. I think it's sponsored by and helped supported by the Builders Association there in Tampa. So it sort of shows their buy-in. What are you hoping the conference will achieve?
Yeah, so we're really talking about solutions. I think everybody talks about the problem. Nobody's really bringing solutions to bear. And so we're going to go through each one of our kind of segments of our best practices. We're going to do a deep dive, and then we're going to come up with a strategy for how we're going to go to Tallahassee and address this issue. Look, we've worked with Florida State and other organizations in order to come up with these best practices. We now have a defined list of best practices that we think the state should begin to implement. We're going to discuss those. We're going to hopefully bring city, county leaders in along with developers and begin to have a robust conversation about what do developers need in order to take vouchers? What are the concerns about accessory dwelling units in communities? What are the challenges of upzoning for communities? And frankly, what are the incentives that Tallahassee has to offer in order to get over some of those hurdles?
You've used the phrase best practices a few times, and I know for people at home that can sort of seem like jargon or speak. When you gave me one example earlier of a best practice, scrubbing through waiting lists, but what are some of the other things that could take place that aren't taking place currently?
Well, cities and counties need to allow for upzoning. For example, allowing for duplexes or triplexes to be built where a traditional single family home is being built. That is a best practice that we've seen around the country, as we have to allow for people to move beyond just single family homes and communities, and we need to allow for more density in those communities. And the only way we're going to do that is through a thing called upzoning, which we've identified as a best practice. Allowing for accessory dwelling units, it's a best practice that we've identified. It's by far the least expensive housing we can build today, and but yet most communities don't allow accessory dwelling units in certain areas of their communities. And we see this push me, pull me going on in Tallahassee. For example, Gainesville tried to do some upzoning, but the governor came in and squashed that. And so ultimately, we need to have a plan for how we're going to deal with 1,000 people a day moving to Florida. And that plan can't just be send people to the suburbs and grow the suburbs. No, it has to include what we're going to do in our local communities. And the simple truth is, if you don't fix zoning, you don't fix housing. And while we're fixing all of that, we need to have a robust voucher program in place to assist people today that are living in their cars, that are living in local motels because they don't have to come up with first and last month's rent, to stabilize them. In order to do that, we need a process that works, and we need developers that are willing to take them. There's really three parties involved: the local government, the individuals that are struggling, and developers in market rate products. The beautiful thing about vouchers is it allows people to choose where they live. They can live closer to their home. They can live closer to school. Florida has about 2.2 million people that would qualify potentially for vouchers if we had the funds available. Today, we have less than 100,000 people that are actively on housing vouchers. But it's shown really to be one of the most robust ways to get people housed quickly.
So roughly right now, the state of Florida spends about how much on vouchers, for housing vouchers?
So between state and federal dollars, we spend about $1.6 billion a year on vouchers. That only covers about 4.6% of eligible households. So we can imagine what that number would have to be. It would have to be closer to almost $25 to $30 billion in combined state and federal dollars. But I think it also shows the need that we're having. I mean, we're only funding 5%, less than 5% of the total need for housing affordability if we were to cover everybody in vouchers. Now, clearly, that's not possible to cover everybody with vouchers, and that's an astronomical amount of money. But it does show where we have room for growth and where we can make our voucher programs more efficient. And so I think it shows that there's a lot more we can do with the housing voucher program to make it more robust, and to find developers that are willing to participate, and to improve the products that we have out there existing in the marketplace today.
We'll be right back after the break. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to contact me at jdefede@cbs.com. I do enjoy hearing from you. Well, that's all the time we have. We'll be back again next week. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.